Denia's story wasn't just good on its own, it made everything around it better. Her relationship with Sigrika, the guilt she carries throughout the quest, the introspective moments with Rover, even the way the Grand Architect is used here. None of this overshadowed Denia's journey, if anything, they strengthen it. What I expected going into this was a solid standalone character story. What I got was Denia's transformation as a character and a much bigger expansion of the larger conflict than I expected. One of the easiest things a story can do is make a character suffer, especially in Wuthering Waves where tragedy and sacrifice are already deeply tied to the world itself. But suffering alone is not what makes a character memorable. What matters is what the story does with that suffering. This story was never really about whether Denia was going to die, that was only the surface level tension. The real conflict was whether Denia still believed her own life had value after everything that happened. By the start of the quest, she had already accepted her fate. The birthday she asked Rover to spend with her is already just an excuse to quietly say goodbye to the people she cares about before disappearing from their lives entirely. Instead of immediately focusing on a massive external threat, the story slows down and lets Denia spend time with the people around her, not as a weapon or a test subject, but simply as a person. Each interaction reveals a different side of her internal struggle. The best example of this is Sigrika. Their relationship is written with a surprising amount of restraint. The dialogue relies heavily on subtext instead of direct exposition. Sigrika understands that something is wrong, even if she does not fully know what it is. Denia never directly tells her either. As a result, every conversation between them carries this quiet sense of uncertainty underneath it. They talk about seeing each other again, about future plans, but Denia already believes that future may never happen. The story trusts the audience to understand what the characters themselves struggle to openly say. More importantly, Sigrika represents the life Denia still wants to hold on to. Despite the guilt, despite everything she believes she has done wrong, Denia still wants connection, she still wants friendship, she still wants a future where she can remain beside the people she cares about. Then the story contrasts that with Natasha. Natasha becomes the living consequence of everything that happened. She lost her arms because of the conflict surrounding Denia, and the future she originally imagined for herself is no longer possible in the same way anymore. What makes this interaction work is that Natasha never blames her. Of course, she doesn't really know, but that's not important here. It's that she is incredibly kind towards Denia throughout the conversation, but that kindness only makes Denia's guilt heavier. Because the story never tries to erase the damage or pretend nothing happened, it focuses on something much more difficult, whether someone who caused harm, even unwillingly, can still continue living with that guilt afterward. This is a far stronger conflict than tragedy for the sake of sadness alone. One of the biggest criticism I had towards the Grand Architect was how detached they felt from the human side of the story. The narrative constantly framed them as this overwhelming presence operating behind almost every major conflict in the background. Their ideology, their plans, and their influence were always important to the plot itself, but the character rarely felt grounded in actual human consequence. Denia changes that completely, because she is not simply connected to the Grand Architect, she is the result of the Grand Architect. Everything they believe in, everything they are willing to sacrifice, and every line they are willing to cross culminates into this single character and what was done to her. And that finally gives the Grand Architect real weight as an antagonist, not because the story suddenly reveals some hidden truth about them, but because we finally understand what their ideology actually does to someone. Denia was treated as an experiment, a tool, a necessary sacrifice for a larger objective. Even after being abandoned by the Grand Architect, the damage they caused continues shaping every aspect of her life. Her guilt, her lack of self-worth, even her willingness to quietly disappear rather than burden the people around her, all trace back to what they turned her into. Which is also why the final reveal hits as hard as it does. The fragment left behind inside Denia was never just a final trap. The Grand Architect designed the entire situation to force Rover into a position where they would have to kill her themselves in order to stop another catastrophe. That changes the conflict entirely. The Grand Architect no longer feels like a distant mastermind moving pieces from the shadows. Now they feel cruel in a deeply personal way, and the story achieves that without relying on dramatic monologues or excessive screen time. Instead, it builds the Grand Architect through the damage left behind on someone else's life. What surprised me even more was how naturally this entire conflict connected back into the rest of the cast. A common problem in long-running gacha stories is that character arcs often feel isolated from the larger narrative. A character receives focus during their release patch, the story revolves around them for a while, and then the world quietly moves on afterward. Denia's quest avoids that problem almost entirely. Every relationship in this story fits back into Denia's journey, but the one that surprised me the most was Rover. Here, Rover is not written as someone who simply arrives with solutions or comforting answers. Their role here is much more introspective than that. Throughout the quest, Denia constantly questions whether she still deserves to continue living after everything that happened. Rover never tries to directly answer that question for her. Instead, the story allows Rover to acknowledge something much more complicated, that some damage cannot simply be erased, that guilt does not disappear overnight, and that even someone viewed as a savior still carries the weight of the people they could not protect. The brief introspection about Rinasita, Mia, and Avidus is one of the strongest moments in the quest because it finally allows Rover's perspective to feel shaped by failure rather than certainty. That small moment adds more humanity to Rover than another heroic speech ever could, and structurally it also strengthens Denia's story at the same time, because the quest never treats her suffering as something isolated from the larger world around her. The characters, the conflict, and the larger narrative continuously shape each other throughout the story. This is why the quest feels much larger than a simple standalone character episode. It feels like a story where every part of the narrative is actively pushing against the others at the same time. One of the smartest decisions this quest makes is that it never truly feels like Denia's story ends here, which changes her role in the narrative completely. One of the most common patterns in the gacha stories that rely heavily on the region-to-region format is that major characters are often tied very heavily to a single region or a single storyline. Their arc reaches its peak during that part of the game, and afterward their presence naturally becomes more limited once the story moves on somewhere else. You can already see that structure with characters like Kartetia and Rinasita or Amet and Lahairoi. They are extremely important characters inside their own arcs. They shape the story, the themes, and the conflicts surrounding their regions. But once their narrative moves forward, their role becomes more static because their stories are so deeply tied to those specific places and events. And sure, some characters still appear outside their own regions afterward, but usually those appearances feel more like callbacks, cameos, or smaller supporting roles rather than the story actively continuing their progression in a major way. Denia feels fundamentally different from that structure because her story is not tied to a single region, it is tied directly to the central conflict of the game itself. The Grand Architect, the Fractious, the consequences of their ideology, the damage left behind by their actions. Denia now exists at the center of all of that, and because the story deliberately leaves her fate unresolved instead of fully concluding her arc, she no longer feels like a temporary spotlight character designed for a single patch cycle. She feels serialized, like someone whose presence can continue evolving naturally alongside the larger narrative no matter where the story goes next, which makes this a fundamentally new structure for Wuthering Waves. By the end of the quest, Denia is no longer simply reacting to the rule forced onto her by the Grand Architect, she actively chooses to go against it, even knowing what it might cost her in the end. That choice completely changes the audience's perspective of her character. She stops feeling like someone carried by the story and starts feeling like someone capable of carrying future parts of the story herself, and I think that shift is part of why her ending leaves such a strong impression. Not simply because her sacrifice hits hard, but because the story gives you the sense that Denia's choices will continue mattering long after this quest ends, which creates a much deeper kind of attachment, because now the audience is no longer only thinking about what happened to Denia, they are thinking about where her story goes next, and I think that is one of the smartest decisions the writers made with this entire arc. Because Denia is not just a character with a tragic story, she's the point where the personal side of Wuthering Waves and the larger structural conflict finally connect. The emotional cost of the Grand Architect ideology made visible in one person's choice. And I know some of you are going to bring this up, the question of whether Denia should have died, whether permanent consequences would have made her story stronger. And honestly, I understand that instinct. Gacha games rarely commit to real stakes. A character dying and staying dead would be a statement. But the question, should she have died, is the wrong framing. Because right now she isn't dead, and she isn't safely back either. She is suspended in the void with an uncertain future, and that suspension is something that outright death wouldn't. It keeps her story open, it forces the audience to wait, it makes her a question the story hasn't answered yet, which is exactly what this entire video has been arguing, that Denia isn't a self-contained emotional episode, she's ongoing, her story hasn't ended, it's waiting for its next chapter. Whether the next chapter is a return or a final goodbye, I don't know, but the current choice, to leave her unresolved rather than definitively closed, is consistent with the kind of storytelling that made her introduction work in the first place. But what do you think? Did you enjoy Dinia's story? And do you think everything here was the right choice for this character and the overall story?